The story is about three friends, Jim, Catherine, and Brian. They were once best friends who wanted to meet after a long time. They agreed on where they would like to meet and even made an appointment, but one of them did not show up at the specified place and time. It was Jim. He was always a very strange guy, not distinguished by his punctuality, and, in some moments from the past, increased cruelty since his teenage years. Therefore, Catherine and Brian were not very surprised by this. They called and texted him, but he didn't respond. A little later, when Catherine and Brian had already returned home, they received an SMS from an unknown number, where an unknown person wrote to them so that they would come where they needed to and at the right time. Otherwise, their friend Jim will die. But what was really hidden under it was the most terrifying thing they could even imagine: a quest with no exit. The remote, abandoned village was drowned in fog, like an old rotting wound on the body of the world. Catherine and Brian, driven by fear for each other, arrived at the location indicated in the creepy message. The dim light of their lanterns cut through the thick gloom, but could not dispel the suffocating atmosphere. The barn, which had once been used as a child, now looked different. The walls were peeling and cracked, and there was a pungent smell of burning and decay in the air. There was a symbol on the old wooden doors, scratched with something sharp. "Come in, but there is no way out." "This doesn't sound like a joke anymore," Catherine whispered, peering into the darkness. Brian nodded and pushed the door open. The awakening of a nightmare. It was damp and cold inside the barn. The walls were decorated with strange newspaper clippings, and dolls without eyes lay on the floor. However, the most terrible thing awaited them in the center of the room. Jim was tied to a huge wooden cross like a sacrificial lamb. "Oh my God! Jim!" Catherine screamed, rushing to him. But as she approached, Jim's body began to move, and it laughed. "You came after all. Great." His voice sounded distorted, as if several beings were speaking in it at once. He slowly raised his head, and in the light of the lantern, his friends saw his face. His eyes were completely blackened, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. "Don't," Brian stepped back. "It's not Jim." Suddenly, the walls of the barn shook. Rotten wood fell from the ceiling, and blood-red candles lit up around them, appearing as if out of thin air. "Welcome to my quest, friends," Jim's voice rang out, but now it came from everywhere, as if the village itself was talking to them. "The game has begun." Silhouettes began to emerge from the darkness. Their movements were jerky, like broken puppets. An empty, dead light burned in the eye sockets of these creatures. "You have 3 trials," Jim said with a grin, his voice like the rasp of rusty metal. "If you pass them, you will leave. Get lost," he chuckled, "and you will stay here forever." The first test, Catherine and Brian found themselves in a room where the walls were covered with mirrors. In the reflection, Catherine saw herself, but not as she was now, but mutilated, leaking black liquid instead of blood. "Only one mirror will show the truth. The rest are a trap." Brian looked at himself and saw that there was someone standing behind him in his reflection. A tall figure with long claws was breathing down his neck, even though there was no one in reality. "If we choose the wrong one, we'll get sucked in," Catherine whispered. They looked at each other and simultaneously pointed at the same mirror, the only one in which their reflections were not distorted. A moment later, the mirror shattered into fragments, from which thick, dark blood flowed. "Well done," Jim's voice sounded. "But it's going to get worse." The second test, the tunnel of flesh. They found themselves in a corridor whose walls seemed to be made of convulsing human skin. Every step was accompanied by a squelching sound, and hands reached out from the walls, trying to grab them. "We need to get to the end," Brian croaked, trying not to look at the writhing faces appearing in the walls. But as soon as they took a few steps, the corridor began to narrow. "Hurry up!" They ran, feeling the walls shrink around them like a stomach preparing to digest food. Catherine screamed as teeth snapped at her foot, leaving a bloody streak on her jeans. Finally, they tumbled out into another room, where the final ordeal awaited them. Third challenge: free Jim, or kill him. Jim was standing in the middle of the room, but now his body was completely changed. His arms stretched out, his fingers turning into long claws. The skin on her face cracked, revealing the dark abyss beneath. "If you don't kill me," he hissed, "I'll take you with me." He rushed at them. Brian grabbed a rusty pipe from the floor and hit Jim on the head, but Jim didn't even feel the pain. Catherine darted to the side and saw an old ritual knife lying on the sacrificial altar. "I'm sorry, Jim." She plunged the blade into his chest. His body shuddered. Blackness began to flow out of the wounds, and he looked at her with human eyes. "Thank you," he whispered before disappearing into a puff of black smoke. The barn shook, the walls cracked, and dark hands began to come out of the cracks, reaching for Catherine and Brian. "Run!" Brian shouted. They jumped out, and at the same moment the barn fell into the void, disappearing from reality. End, or not. The next morning, Catherine woke up at home. Everything seemed normal, until she looked in the mirror. There was a mark on her neck. It was as if someone was holding her, trying to drag her back.